All right, well, thank you, Rich Hudson, out there in Washington. I want to bring in right now Congressman Brad Sherman of California and Congressman Randy Neugebauer of Texas. Both are on the House Financial Services Committee, but they stand on very different sides of the aisle when it comes to credit card legislation. First, Brad Sherman, I want to bring in with you. You're one of the sponsors of this bill. Congressman Sherman, you brought this back again. Why not just let the Fed's rules that take effect 1 year from now stand as is?
Well, first, they take effect 1 year from now. Second, they could be changed at any time by any Federal Reserve that might exist in the future. And finally, there's some additional things that may be added to this bill that go well beyond what the Fed has done. We need to tell people that there's a law that protects them from abusive credit card practices.
Well, Congressman Neugebauer, you know, everybody, I think, if you line them up, I think we could get a gripe story about credit card companies from just about everybody. So everybody loves to hate the credit card companies. But we also know that every time Congress tries to interject somehow legislation into the way that they do business, it seems to get worse. We get these thick disclosure forms nobody reads. How are you going to fix what you think is a problem?
Well, one of the things I've said all along is I'm not sure we need more regulation, but what we do is for consumers to have better information. I have been a proponent of a more simpler disclosure form so that when people are making credit decisions, whether it's about credit cards or mortgages or auto loans, that they're looking at a uniform form and they understand the basic terms of that credit. One of the things I'm concerned about is certainly we're all trying to make sure that this is an important tool for consumers and American people to have. But what I'm concerned about is it's going to begin to limit their choices. If we begin to limit the ability of these credit card companies to offer certain products, what I'm afraid of is that the choices get smaller and smaller, and some people that have been relying on that as a very valuable tool somehow get shut out of the process. We're already seeing across the country credit card companies begin to restrict the amount of credit, change the terms, because they're concerned not only about the state of the economy, but I think that they're very concerned about the federal government coming in and intervening in their businesses in a way that causes them not to be able to provide some of these services.
Well, Congressman Sherman, let's go back to now the restrictions and the rules that you're putting in place, you're proposing. Your version is even lighter than the Senate version. Our reporter in Washington mentioning that the Senate version is even harsher. The argument could be made, though, that these are going to actually drive up credit card prices and fee prices for all Americans because the banks are going to have to make money somewhere if indeed these new restrictions come into place that you're proposing.
Well, look, the LIBOR is at 2 or 3%. That's the rate at which banks borrow money. They're charging, in many cases, 20, 25% interest. I think they're making enough. As to the idea that, well, the banks need to make money, so let's not require them to mail the statement 21 days before the statement is due. Let's have them trick people with universal defaults. I don't buy the idea that the banks need money and it just doesn't matter what kind of chicanery they engage in order to get it. Nor do I think that we can just rely on disclosure because, as I think you pointed out and as Randy pointed out, you've got these 20-page tiny print disclosures. Everybody throws them away. And I don't care whether they're 8 pages or 88 pages. That's not what's going to protect people. What will protect people is a rule that says if you borrow money at a certain rate, they can't jack up the rate just because you have a credit dispute with a different bank.
Adam, you know what? You were in Washington for a long time, and you've covered all of this. And in particular, this goes back to the fight between the banks and legislation and the Fed. You've got three very powerful entities all fighting out for basically control right now of consumer credit.
Well, and the issue, though, that it doesn't seem that's getting addressed is that people use their credit cards for their everyday expenses. And what we're going through is a shift out of that. And what this might protect is people to do that, and that's not a good thing. It's one of the reasons we're in the mess right now. And at the point, though, that the Federal Reserve has already instituted these rules that take place in a year, I mean, I'm not the greatest fan of the Federal Reserve's policies, but this seems to be, if we're going to be protected, the right way to go, given the fact that the protections we had beforehand didn't really work.
John, do you agree with that?
Well, I think one of the things we need to bear in mind is that it's not simply banks are borrowing at 2 or 3% and lending at 20%. They have losses. The unemployment rate is 8.5%. Consumer credit and rising. Consumer credit is going to be a real issue in terms of the quality of that credit, the rate of default. So We have to bear in mind that banks have to have the ability to cover those credit losses, and it's credit losses that has brought this economy to its knees, not the level of interest rates.
Congressman Sherman, I want to clarify one thing you said. You said something about the fact that you think the credit card companies are making enough money. Are you trying to regulate how much money they make?
No, I'm just not trying to shed crocodile tears for the idea that, oh, they'll be deprived of the ability to engage in abusive practices in order to squeeze even more money. The fact is, they're free under this bill to set high rates. That's something at least the consumer can understand, and understand the difference between a 9% rate and a 19% rate and a 29% rate. But it's when they enter into all of a sudden getting you to borrow their money at one rate and then suddenly jacking up the interest rate and imposing that new interest rate on your old balance. When they trick you, that's wrong. If they want to honestly say that their service costs 29%, let them say that in plain English.
Congressman Neugebauer, okay, look, since you did vote no on this, what would you propose instead? What would you rather see us do right now?
Well, what we know is the Federal Reserve has already moved in a direction to, I think, tighten up some of the things that some of the people that are proposing this legislation want to do. But one of the things I'm concerned about is that it still doesn't fix the underlying problem, and that is that we have a better disclosure. The American people are empowered. There are tens of thousands of opportunities for them to pick the credit card that's best suited for their needs. What we need to do is make sure that they have the ability to do that, but more importantly, make sure that we don't limit the products that are available through providers, but also have a disclosure form that allows them to, in a very clear and concise way, know what they're signing up for. But we also need to make sure that the credit card companies can manage their own risk and not have to manage risk as assuming that we're all the same. What I'm afraid of is in some of the things that are in this bill would cause them to raise everybody's rates, even for those people that have been paying on time, don't revolve their accounts, but in order to cover some of the losses because they don't feel like they have the ability to manage their risk appropriately, that they raise the credit for everyone.
Real quick, Congressman
if
Sherman.
I can interject.
Real quick, Congressman Sherman.
Yeah, I think simplicity requires that you not allow them to offer tricky products. You could disclose on page 92 of the disclosure statement that while you usually get 21 days to pay, they'll jack it back to 18 in order to trick you, and then make it 12, and then double cycle your billing. We ought to prohibit some illegal practices rather than simply saying, well, or wrongful practices, rather than simply saying we'll disclose them on page 22 of a statement that nobody could possibly read unless their eyes are much better than mine.
We'll see what the president has to say with all these executives, and they meet in the Roosevelt Room later on today. Gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. Congressman Randy Neugebauer from Texas, Brad Sherman, of course, from California. Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's bring in Scott Valentin.